Hello everyone, I'm Emily. You might see me with my speeches and others. Today, because I realise that many comrades and people do not have access to the books and other resources that I have, or that are out of print, I have to put on myself to do a reading list of these books so that the understandings of disabled people and their histories can indeed come to many people who either struggle to read or wanted to listen to it while doing so, and there is no audiobook or audio presentation that yet. The first book in the series we're going to go on to is A Very Capitalist Condition by Roddy Sloshed. I'll be reading it from my Kindle app on my computer, so I'm looking forward, and I'll not be as forward as I once was. I'll be drinking my coffee. I will be reading relatively slow, and I will see if I can screen share or show the screen at some point when reading, which I'm going to do now at some point. So then, introduction. Disability in contemporary society is a complex and widely misunderstood issue. Two contradictory trends in recent years illustrate this well. The first, Global Report on Disability, published by the World Health Organization in 2011, identified 1 billion disabled people, 15% of the global population. As a proportion of the total, this figure is expected to continue rising for the foreseeable future. Since its adoption in December of 2006, over 150 countries have ratified the United Nations Convention on Human Rights of People with Disabilities. Thanks largely to the pressure from the world's most influential disability movements, Britain and the US adopted anti-discrimination laws championed by the UN as models of best practice. Anti-discrimination. Many other states have adopted similar legislation, with others likely to follow in the near future. As an international political issue, the profile of disabled rights has in many respects never been higher. Another side to disability, however, is better known to many more people. Today, the media and governments in Britain and the US have routinely alleged of fraud by benefit scroungers or fakers to justify drastic cuts in disability-related benefits and services. In a climate of escalating austerity and protracted economic crisis, this pattern has increasingly been emulated elsewhere. In Britain, definitions have been altered to reduce the number of those who deemed genuinely disabled and therefore supposedly deserving of support. The drastic nature of these welfare reforms is perhaps best illustrated by the fact that in summer of 2015, disabled activists succeeded in persuading the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Disabled Persons with Disabilities to investigate alleged violations of disabled people human rights in the UK. The findings of the confidential investigation are due to be published in 2017. Another aspect of this more negative side of disability is the remarkable fact that the vast majority of those still officially classified as disabled neither disclose this to employers nor identify such to anyone else. What explains these contradictory trends? What, indeed, is disability in the first place? This book sets out to answer these questions by examining the social and historical roots of the nature of disability discrimination. Disability was first identified as a particular form of discrimination at the end of the 19th century. The modern disability movement, however, only emerged in the last decades after the in the decades after the Second World War, referred to by one author as the last civil rights movement. Disability activism only began to peak after others, such as those of women, black people, gays and lesbians, had already passed into decline. In Britain, the disability movement had recently received, after an absence of 20 years in response to government cuts in disability-related benefits and services, revived. Most writings about disability falls into one of three categories. First, there are personal stories, mainly of overcoming adversity or the tragedy of living with impairment. Although tending to reinforce stereotypical notions of heroic superhumans, these may often provide important insights into the lives of individual disabled people. Second, there are accounts by and for healthcare or social care service professionals. Finally, most discussion in academic discipline of disability studies take place in expensive specialist journals, the language of which is often impenetrable and the content of questionable reliance or relevance. The aim of this book is to build up on the scattered handful of historical accounts of disability and disabled people to provide a wider history that is also accessible to a broader audience. The book locates the emergence of disability in a wider history of class society in general and capitalist society in particular. It takes the view that understanding its development, roots and nature as a particular form of oppression is key to the wider project of human emancipation. Asking the question, what is disability, prompts a range of different answers. For most people, the term refers to a range of limitations in the mental and physical functioning of individuals, an approach reflected in most of the current disability-related legislation in Britain and elsewhere. The first chapter of this book, therefore, traces the development of the term and associated meanings, addressing, in addition to the related and often thorny question of terminology. One set of ideas has more influence among disability activists and those working in the disability field than any other, with its origins in a tiny and obscure group of socialist wheelchair users, and with the avowedly materialist perspective. The social model of disability has been a political and ideological battleground since its development in the 1980s. What does this conception of disability have to say about impairment or other forms of oppression? Chapter 2 makes a critical defence of the social model, finding the alternatives offered by its many critics as deficient in several important respects, most critically in terms of their relative utility as a vehicle for change. Unlike the social model, however, this account is unequivocally in seeing impairment and disability alike as, for the most part, social in origin. Having established a framework within which to discuss disability, the following three chapters discuss its historical development. Recent research has provided further evidence that people with impairments have not always been marginalised or discriminated against. It is clear that social attitudes varied depending on the nature of a given society. Despite the many difficulties inherent in looking back at ancient societies, it is evident that the development of class distinctions had a negative impact on the fortunes of people with impairments. If pre-class societies did not exclude or marginalise such people, then this must be possible for an alternative future society. Although early origins can be found in the late feudal period, the evidence demonstrates it was the rise of industrial capitalism that created disability as a distinct form of oppression. Successive innovations in medicine, science and technology led on the one hand to more disabled people surviving and living more independent lives, while at the same time marginalising them on the grounds that their labour was less productive. The Marxist concepts of alienation and exploitation have been either too crudely applied or completely neglected in existing accounts. They are, however, vital to understanding the nature of disability in contemporary capitalist society. The drive for profit and cynical but chaotic disruption of economic booms and slumps have led to the marginalisation or exclusion of disabled people from the workforce. The most advanced economies in the late 19th century and early 20th century, particularly Germany, Britain and the United States, were home to eugenicist movements that saw different physical and mental impairments as evidence of degeneracy and or imperial decline. Rooted in concepts of racial and genetic superiority, these ideas were taken to their extreme and logical conclusion in Nazi Germany, with the mass murder of certain groups of disabled people demonised as economic burdens. Until the evidence on the Nazi side began to emerge, versions of eugenic ideas were more widely shared, even among some socialists of the period, and have since been reappeared in different forms. Chapter 7 looks at the main principles involved in this issue. As capitalist production assumes a bigger and more global scale, so the wars it generates have led to greater and more widespread destruction. Ironically, such wars have often proved to be drivers of social and economic change. As the First World War ended in revolutions and mass unrest, injured soldiers, particularly in Germany, played a direct role in winning social gains. In Chapter 8, looks at the history of disabled war veterans and their relationship to wider social movements. Chapter 9 looks at the history of disability movements and highlights some lesser known events involving groups of disabled people which predate the modern disability movement, and considers their countries where such movements have not developed. Finally, it discusses the disability charities and their constant and contradictory role in the lives of many people. Disability movements have sometimes excluded certain groups either because they disagree with that they were indeed disabled, or for more complex reasons. People experiencing mental health difficulties comprise the largest group of disabled people, and also perhaps the most misunderstood. On a global scale, depression alone is projected to become the single biggest cause of impairment by 2030. Of all areas of disability, mental health arouses the greatest fear, ignorance, and discrimination, including among other disabled people. Chapter 10 argues that mental distress is best understood as a form of disability, and therefore also as a social problem demanding a social solution. Another social group has historically remained separate from the disability movement, in large part because of their representatives have not considered themselves to be disabled. Many deaf people see themselves instead as a linguistic minority with a distinct history and culture. Chapter 11 discusses this disputed area along the varying fortunes of sign language. Part of the following chapter develops this debate on the nature and perceptions of impairment and disability, this time in relation to learning difficulties and neurodiversity. This chapter also goes on to tackle perhaps the most controversial issues in the book: disability hate crime and assisted suicide. The latter particularly raises further and more complex issues of disability rights in contemporary society. This brings us to the nature and place of disability discrimination in contemporary capitalist society. Far from the 21st century signaling new progress for humanity, global austerity, wars, and environmental and climate chaos threaten to thrust us dramatically backwards. Chapter 13 brings together the previous strands discussed to analyse the particularities of disability as a form of oppression, examining in addition the reasons for the greater prominence of disability as a political issue in recent years. The final chapter asks whether science is an ally or an enemy of progress. It then goes on to address the key question implicit throughout the book. Is it possible to build a genuinely inclusive society for many disabled people who work and the many others who do not? Could a future society completely abolish disability as a form of discrimination? While considerable effort has been made to provide a more global analysis, the bulk of this literature, research and statistical material currently is available in US or UK sources. This reflects the fact that these are respectively the most powerful and oldest of the advanced capitalist nation states, where disability movements have also had the greatest influence in the introduction and development of relevant legislation and services. The UK is also, of course, where both the social model disability and the academic discipline of disability studies first developed. Finally, as the title implies, this book is written from a Marxist perspective. The scale and severity of the current economic crisis have helped prompt renewed interest in such ideas. The popular views remain, however, that such an approach offers little to the understanding of social oppression. I hope this account demonstrates that, on the contrary, only Marxism offers the necessary tools to explain the roots and nature of disability as a form of discrimination, as well as offering a vision as to how it can be overcome. This particular chapter, when I first read it, began my journey into getting radicalised, and this particular book actually has got a place in my heart for radicalising me when my Tourette's became visible. Discrimination and hate crimes started to amass, exclusion became the norm, and I began to ask why. The introduction made me feel not just seen, but answered questions and wanted me to read more. And of course, as some of it I knew about it from disparate different parts here and there. As you will read on in other chapters, it can be quite hardcore emotionally and difficult to hear, but we must understand the history and oppression of disabled people. These are my people, and often this analysis is either ignored or worse, not seen as relevant to building a new and better society. I hope this first introduction is going well. Please excuse my voice, it's a bit raspy. I'll get these videos be out every 3 days or so, perhaps even sooner, and there will be a playlist of each and every single one of them so that you can listen to it as a complete audiobook. Until next time, I hope this will give you food for thought and a little taster of what to come in the next book and others in the series. And hopefully you're having a good day, and if you're not, I hope you're coping well and dealing with it the best you can. This is Emily, I'll see you later, and until next time, nothing about us without us.